Decimals. Decimals use place value to represent an amount. To read a decimal, like we have here, first read the number to the left as a whole number, followed by and, then read the number to the right of the decimal, followed by the last place value. So this number would be read as 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. This number could also be represented as a mixed number. 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. Let's look at another decimal. 5 and 8,139 10,000ths. We could write this number as an improper fraction by taking the 5 plus, this would be 8/10ths since it's in the tenths place, plus 1/100ths, plus 3,000ths, plus 9/10,000ths, which would give us 58,139 10,000ths. So we've seen a decimal in decimal form. We've seen it represented as a mixed number and also as an improper fraction. Ratios. A ratio is a comparison between two quantities. You can think of a ratio like a fraction, and since it's just like a fraction, a comparison of two numbers, it is treated a lot like a fraction, meaning you're going to simplify it anytime you can. Let's look at this problem. Suppose a sampling of fish from a local pond contains 12 bass, 8 catfish, 38 minnows, and 4 trout. What is the ratio, so the comparison of two numbers, of bass to minnows? Now, when they ask you this question, they're telling you exactly how to set your ratio up. Since it says bass to minnows, we read left to right. We also read from top to bottom. Since a ratio is a fraction, then they're telling you what your numerator should be and what your denominator should be. So our ratio is going to be bass to minnows. And now we can substitute how many bass and minnows we have. According to our problem, we have 12 bass and we have 38 minnows. So that ratio would be 12 to 38. But again, since this is a fraction, we're going to simplify it if we can. And 12 and 38 do have a GCF of 2, so we're going to divide 12 by 2 to get 6, and we'll divide 38 by 2 to get 19. Therefore, our ratio of bass to minnows is 6 to 19. But that's not the only way we can write a ratio. We could also write it as 6 to 19, or as 6 to 19. And these all mean the same thing, and they all give you the same information, that for every 6 bass in the pond, there are 19 minnows in your pond. It is important, though, the order of your numbers. Since the ratio they were asking for was bass to minnows, your bass number should be first, and then your minnows number. So make sure you put it in the right order. That is very important.
In math, we have rational numbers and we have irrational numbers. So we're going to be taking a look at rational numbers, which have 4 different categories, and those are integers, percents, fractions, and decimals. So we're going to define each of these. Even if you're already somewhat familiar with them, we're going to go ahead and define them and give some examples. So starting out with integers. Integer is a positive or negative whole number or 0. So 9 would be a whole number. It would be an integer because it's a positive whole number. Negative 6 is an integer because it's a negative whole number. Then, of course, 0 is an integer because we said it was. And so now we move on to percent, which is kind of a more complicated way to say percent is a part per 100. So an example of a percent is 20%, which we could also write as 20 parts per 100. But the important thing here is just you know what a percent is, like 20%. Then fractions, which is a proportion. So an example would be 20 divided by 10 or 2 divided by 4. And of course we have decimals, so this is where we have an integer, maybe 1, maybe 89, maybe 0. And then we have a decimal place, and then we have numbers after the decimal, like 20.53. So we have our integer, we have a decimal, and then we have numbers after the decimal. So integers, percents, fractions, and decimals are all rational numbers, usually. There are some rules. So in order to be a rational number, just summarize, it either has to be an integer, like we talked about. If it's a number like 9, negative 6, 0, it's always going to be a rational number. It gets more complicated when we come to fractions and decimals. If it's a fraction, it has to be an integer divided by an integer. And this integer cannot equal 0. So it's an integer divided by an integer. So 7 divided by 4 cuts it. That works. Now, decimals are a little bit more complicated because it either has to be a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal. So an example of a terminating decimal would be something like 2 divided by 4. From that you get 0.5. It ends right there at the 5. Or a repeating decimal, you do 1 divided by 3 and you get 0.3333. It goes on forever. But notice we're getting the same number every time. So really you could erase all of these 3's and just put a line over the 3 showing it's a repeating decimal. What you don't want is a decimal like pi, where you have 3.1415926. 5359. It just keeps going on and on. So there's no ending to it, so it's not a terminating decimal, and there's no pattern to it, so it's not a repeating decimal. That's what an irrational number is, one that just keeps going like this. These numbers, they have basically a stopping point. And so that's what we're looking for. And so the reason I say that a fraction has to be an integer over an integer is because when you divide an integer by an integer, you get a clean number. You get a decimal that's repeating or terminating. When you start dividing a decimal or a fraction by a number or a fraction by another fraction, that's when you're going to start getting messy. So really, if you're wondering whether a fraction is a rational number, what you can do is go ahead and divide it out and then look at the decimal and decide whether it's terminating, repeating, or non-ending. And that's how you can determine if it was a rational number.
Multiples. You can think of multiples as like counting by that number. So for instance, the multiples of 2 would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. The multiples of 3 would be 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. The multiples of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and so on. Sometimes you're asked to find the LCM of 2 or more numbers. The LCM is the least common multiple. Least meaning the smallest, common meaning the same, and multiple. So if we wanted to find the LCM of, let's say, 2 and 3, the least common multiple of 2 and 3, so the smallest number that 2 and 3 have in common, would be 6. So that's the LCM of 2 and 3. The LCM of, say, 3 and 4, the very smallest number that they have in common would be 12. And you can find the least common multiple of bigger numbers, like, say, the least common multiple of 12 and 15. So 12 would be 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, etc. While 15 would be 15, 30, 45, 60. Oh, so if we were finding the LCM of 12 and 15, the smallest number they have in common is 60. So the least common multiple is 60. Fractions. A fraction is a number that is expressed as one integer written above another integer with a dividing line between them, like x divided by y. So for example, 3/4. In this fraction, 3/4, the top number is called the numerator, and the bottom number is called the denominator. The numerator is the part that's being considered, while the denominator is the whole. So in this fraction, 3/4, we could take a pie shape and cut it into 4 pieces. That's our whole. And the part that's being considered is 3/4. So 1, 2, 3. So now you can see how much of our pie we're talking about, 3/4. We can manipulate fractions, and we do this by multiplying or dividing both the numerator and the denominator by the same number, not by adding and subtracting. We manipulate fractions to do many things. One thing is to compare them. If we were to compare 3/4 and 2/3, we would first need to find what's called a common denominator. Because in order to compare them, I need them to have the same denominator. So I can tell which one's bigger or if they're equal. So we'll take 3/4 and 2/3, and we're going to find a common denominator. When you do that, you want to look for multiples of the denominators. And the least common multiple will be the least common denominator. So the multiples of 4 and 3, 4 is 4, 8, 12, 16, etc. 3 is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. So the least common multiple between 4 and 3 is 12. So that means I want to change this fraction to something over 12. Same with my other fraction. What I'm doing is creating an equivalent fraction. 3/4 is equal to something over 12. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator both by 3 to achieve that denominator of 12. So 3 times 3 is 9. And so our fraction is 9/12. And then for 2/3, we'll do a similar thing. We want to change our denominator from 3 to 12. So we multiply 3 times 4 to get 12. And we must do the same to our numerator. 2 times 4 is 8. So now we can easily see which fraction is larger. 3/4 is equivalent to or equal to 9/12, and 2/3 is equal to 8/12. Well, 9 out of 12 is definitely more than 8 out of 12. So we could say that this fraction 3/4 is bigger than this fraction 2/3 if we were to compare them. So let's talk a little bit more about equivalent fractions. All of these fractions are equivalent fractions because they all represent the same value. 2/10, 3/15, 4/20, 5/25. And we could see that they represent the same value more easily by simplifying our fractions. So we said we can manipulate fractions by multiplying the numerator and denominator by the same value, or we can manipulate them by dividing the numerator and denominator by the same value. So if we wanted to simplify this fraction 2/10, we would just divide the numerator and the denominator by the same value. Both 2 and 10 are divisible by 2. So we divide our numerator by 2 and our denominator by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We do the same thing to our next fraction. 3 and 15 are both divisible by 3. So we divide our numerator by 3 and our denominator by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 15 divided by 3 is 5. 4/20. Our numerator and denominator are both divisible by 4. So divide by 4, divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 20 divided by 4 is 5. Finally, 5/25. Numerator and denominator are both divisible by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. And 25 divided by 5 is 5. So as you can see, all 4 of these fractions are equal to 1/5. 1/5 is the simplest form of these fractions, and they are all equivalent fractions since they all have the same value, 1/5. Meiosis. Sexual reproduction in eukaryotes involves a form of cell division known as meiosis. It has several different stages that are carried out to let one diploid germ cell result in 4 haploid gametes. And diploid means that it's going to have multiple copies of the genetic information, where haploid means it's going to have 1 copy. So, in this first part, this would be interphase, and it's kind of before meiosis starts, but it has to do with it because this diploid germ cell contains genetic information from both a maternal and paternal parents. So you've got female and male genetic material in this one diploid germ cell, and it's getting ready to divide to carry out sexual reproduction. So we have replication going on in here because each chromosome is going to double itself so that there's extra genetic material to carry out this process. In the next phase, we have prophase. And the replicated genetic material is going to line up in homologous pairs, which means that each one is the same genetic material. It's an exact copy. And they're going to cross over a little bit at these points here. And where those cross over, they kind of swap a little bit of genetic material. So each one of these pairs is going to take a little bit of the other pair. And that is called crossing over or recombination. So you're just kind of jumbling up the maternal and paternal bits before the division starts to take place. Then we move on to metaphase. And in metaphase, your centrosomes are starting to pull the homologous pairs apart. And then we move on to anaphase. And you can see they actually are getting pulled further apart. They're not crossing over anymore, and they're starting to move to opposite sides of the cell. And these are all prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, because this is kind of a two-step process. Then we keep going, and we've got telophase 1. In telophase 1, there's the cleavage furrow that's preparing for the cells to separate and become two distinct separate cells. There is a nucleus being reformed. The microtubules that have been connecting the chromosomes and pulling them apart have receded, and the genetic material is encased in a nucleus again. And then this last part is cytokinesis 1, where the cytoplasm is split, and there is a definite split made between those two cells. So now there are two diploid daughter cells. So we had our diploid germ cell. The DNA, the genetic material was all replicated, so there was twice as much. We went through this cell division, so now each one of these daughter cells is a diploid daughter cell, and it has twice as much genetic material as it needs to be a haploid gamete. So we're going to go through what is known as meiosis 2, the second step in this process. So we have prophase 2. And in this phase, you'll see we've got the two daughter cells, and now they're kind of repeating the same process that happened up top. So there's no replication because that was an interphase, but they are going to start having the centrosomes move down to either side and start moving out to opposite poles of the cell and start pulling the chromosomes that way. In the next phase, we've got metaphase 2. You can see that the chromosomes have lined up along the equatorial plate in both of these daughter cells. The microtubules are connecting them to the centrosomes, and they're going to start pulling apart. So in our next phase, anaphase 2, you can see that actually happen. The chromosome pairs have gotten pulled apart, and now these individual chromatids are on separate sides of the cell, and they're still going to be kind of being reeled in by the microtubules at this point. And we move on to telophase 2, where we've got a nucleus forming around our new pairs of genetic material that have both the mother and father genetic material in each nucleus. They're all split up now, and we have the cleavage furrow again. The cells are getting ready to divide permanently. Your centrosomes have separated to the opposite sides still, and the microtubules have retracted. And then we go to cytokinesis 2, which is where the cytoplasm divided between these two new cells and these two new cells, and now we've got 4 haploid gametes, which means that they each just have one set of genetic information, and they're going to need a partner to be able to reproduce. So these gametes are going to be ready to be fertilized, and when they are fertilized, a diploid zygote will be formed. So these gametes are ready to be fertilized, and if they are, then they can go on to create a new eukaryotic organism. So meiosis does have a two-part process, and it goes through the same phases as mitosis, but they're a little bit different because instead of just getting an exact copy, you're mixing genetic material from two different organisms, a maternal and paternal parent, and at the end you're going to have the 4 haploid gametes that each has genetic information from both parents. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, contains all of the hereditary or genetic material in humans and most other organisms. So the DNA is what lets people know what genetic material is in a person or is in a certain creature or other organism. Now each cell in an organism has the same DNA. So if someone were to get a piece of your hair and a fingernail and a piece of skin and look at it very closely and look at the DNA in all 3 would be the same, and it would let whoever was looking at this know that all 3 of those articles came from the same person. This is the same for other organisms. Each cell in the organism's body is going to have the same DNA pattern so that you'll be able to tell that it came from the same creature. Most DNA is found in the nucleus of a cell. There is some DNA in the mitochondria, and then it is known as mitochondrial DNA, or it would look like this if you saw an abbreviation for it. So if you see the little MT before DNA in the abbreviation, that's because it's mitochondrial DNA and it's found in the mitochondria instead of the nucleus. But most DNA is going to be in the nucleus. Now, that important hereditary information found in DNA is stored as a code made up of 4 chemical bases. We've got adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. And each one of those bases is only going to pair with one other base. They can't all pair up with any of the other 3. So adenine pairs with thymine, and guanine pairs with cytosine to form base pairs. And a way that I remember that is that the ones with the straight lines in their abbreviation letter, the A and T that can be made with straight lines, go together, and the ones that require a curved line go together. And that helps me remember that adenine pairs with thymine, these straight lines to form A and straight lines to form T, and guanine goes with cytosine because of the curved shape that it takes to make each of those abbreviation letters. The sequence of the adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine pairs determines how the organism builds and maintains itself. So it's important to think about this. Not every organism or every person is going to have the exact same sequence of base pairs. And you might think of the alphabet. We use 26 letters to form all of our words and sentences, but the way that they're arranged, the sequence of those letters, is what lets us know what word is being communicated, what sentence is trying to be communicated. And each word has a different meaning, even though it's made up of the same 26 letters or some subset of those letters. So it works the same way. You're going to have some sequence of adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and those base pair sequence is going to let you know, or let a scientist know, what that organism does to maintain itself, what kind it is. Is it functioning properly? Is everything in the right order? What does that order tell us? The same way that seeing CAT tells us that that is the word cat. And it's talking about a mammal with pointy ears and whiskers and a tail that's kept as a pet. Let's look at the next part. Each base pair, so our adenine thymine pair or guanine cytosine pair, is going to attach to a sugar molecule and to a phosphate molecule. And once those attach, once a base pair attaches to the sugar molecule and phosphate molecule, it forms a nucleotide. And these nucleotides form two long strands that spiral into a double helix. That is the shape that DNA takes on. And I did my best to give you all an example of a double helix. It kind of spirals around. If you were to curl a ribbon around my pen, it would form that kind of double helix shape we're talking about. And you should think of a twisted ladder with the base pairs as rungs. So if we were looking at this picture here, this would be our double helix shape that's spiraling around, and each one of these little rungs on the ladder would be a base pair. So we would have adenine and thymine together, and they would be paired up. And then here you would have guanine and cytosine paired up. And then you would have adenine and thymine, guanine and cytosine, all the way down the ladder, where you've got your sugar molecules and phosphate molecules that bound to your base pairs, making up the sides of the ladder here. And you just have this long DNA chain, and then the sequence that you see is going to let you know how that organism builds and maintains itself, because not every creature's DNA is going to be the same. Everyone has a very unique DNA pattern. DNA can replicate or make copies of itself by splitting the ladder in half. So if we're looking at this and we just decided to go through and cut this ladder in half, we would be separating those base pairs all the way down. So then you have AG, and any other base pairs you've got. So we know we've got adenine, guanine, and because we know what's on one side of the ladder, each strand or half of that ladder serves as a pattern for duplicating bases. Since we know we've got adenine here, we know the thing that has to pair with it is thymine. If we've got guanine, cytosine has to pair with it. Since in DNA, adenine and thymine always pair together and guanine and cytosine pair together, you will know, or the cell will know, okay, I've got this DNA, I've only got half of it, but it's a pattern. If I have adenine, I need to add thymine to the other side. If I've got cytosine, I need to add guanine to the other side. So the cell will know, based on that half, that strand that it gets from DNA, how to make a complete DNA molecule and be able to form that double helix and complete the DNA strand. And each new cell needs an exact copy of DNA from the old cell. Because remember, each cell in an organism has the exact same DNA. So if the DNA is replicating itself, it needs to be giving an exact copy to a new cell so that this can continue, and the organism is going to continue to have the same DNA in it. So you will see a lot about DNA in biology, and it's important to remember that DNA is the hereditary or genetic material. It's usually found in the nucleus. And remember which bases pair with which. Your straight lines in adenine, A, pair with your straight lines in thymine, T, and your curve G for guanine goes with your curve C for cytosine. DNA is the hereditary or genetic material that is usually found in the nucleus, sometimes in the mitochondria. The most important thing to remember is that it's where all the genetic material is going to be found. It's a big identifier for a cell or for an organism.
An experiment is a set of actions and observations performed to confirm or not confirm a hypothesis or to research a causal relationship between phenomena. Now, only one condition in an experiment is changed at a time. So the conditions that affect the outcome we call variables, and then the factors in experiments that do not change are called constants. So we're dealing with variables and constants. So again, variables are the factors that do change, and constants are the variables that do not change. Now, experiments have two parts. We have the control group and the experimental group. If we just had an experimental group, we would not be able to determine anything from the observations of an experiment. That's why we need a control group, which is the group under normal conditions. So nothing unusual is done to it. And then we have the experimental group, which is the test group in which variables are changed. So the experimental group is the most important, but we have to have a control group to understand what's going on in the experimental group. So in other words, if you're changing variables here, you don't know what effect they're having because you don't have a normal group. So you start out with a group under normal conditions, and then you go to the experimental group where you only change one variable at a time. And so by changing that one variable, you get to compare the differences between the experimental group and the control group. So we're looking at cause and effect here, because you have one variable that's going to cause other things to happen. So we start out with the independent variable. Which is a manipulated variable in an experiment or study whose presence or degree determines the change in the dependent variable. And so then that leads us obviously to the dependent variable, which is the observed variable in an experiment or study whose changes are determined by the presence or degree of one or more independent variables. So we have an independent variable and a dependent variable. One's manipulated and the other is observed. So the independent variable is the variable you're changing. Remember, I said you can only change one variable. So you're changing the independent variable, and we're looking at cause and effect. So the independent variable causes an effect with the dependent variable. So that's what you're looking at here, the cause and effect between the independent and dependent variables. I want to take a look at 4 of the basic properties of gases. And I want to talk about the properties of gases in the context of a balloon, so that it gives us something to visualize when we're talking about these properties. So think of a balloon, and as you blow air into this balloon, you're adding molecules to the air. As more of this air gets added to the balloon, the volume is going to increase, which makes sense. Everyone knows when you blow air into a balloon, the balloon expands. And if you let air out of the balloon, then the balloon gets smaller. So volume is proportional to the amount of gas. Now, for this to be true, the temperature and the pressure has to be constant. And you may be wondering, why is that? Well, you'll see later that temperature affects the volume and the pressure affects the volume. So if the temperature and pressure are changing, then they're also affecting the volume in addition to the amount of gas, and we can no longer really see what's really affecting the volume. So volume is no longer proportional to the amount of gas. But if temperature and pressure are constant through this entire time, we can pretty much take them out of the equation because they're not affecting anything anymore because they're not changing. So when temperature and pressure are constant, we can then say volume is proportional to the amount of gas. Now, the second property of gas is also very interesting. If you think about a balloon that has a fixed amount of air in it, in other words, the end's tied off. You can't add air, you can't remove air. And then you heat this balloon, it will expand. The volume will increase. As you heat it, the balloon will get bigger. Now, if you cool the balloon, then the volume will decrease. The balloon will get smaller. So we can say the volume changes directly with temperature. As temperature increases, volume increases. And as temperature decreases, volume decreases. Now, for this to be true, the pressure of the balloon has to remain constant throughout the entire process. Now, if you squeeze the balloon, the volume will decrease because gases are compressible. So we can say the volume changes inversely with the pressure. And this makes sense. Okay, so say there's lots of pressure. You're pushing really hard on this balloon. The volume is going to decrease. So at that point, the pressure is increasing because you're pushing harder, but the volume is decreasing. And if the pressure decreases and you're not pushing as hard, then the volume will increase. So that's why we say volume changes inversely with the pressure. And for this to be true, the temperature has to remain constant. Now, the fourth and final property of a gas. If you fix the volume of the balloon and add more air, then the pressure inside will increase. So we can say pressure changes directly with the amount of gas. And this makes sense because you think about air molecules inside that balloon. They're moving all over the place. Well, if volume or if the amount of gas is large, then the molecules are going to hit the sides very often. Okay, so you think about the volume being the same throughout this whole time. The balloon is always going to be the same size. But if you add more air to it, then there's more air molecules that are going to hit the side of the balloon more often. So that increases pressure. But if there's less air inside that balloon, then the air molecules are going to hit the sides of the balloon less often, which decreases the pressure. So that's why we say pressure changes directly with the amount of gas. Now, for this to be true, like I said, the volume has to be constant and the temperature also has to be constant. So those are the 4 basic properties of gases.
Rocks versus minerals. Let's look at a side-by-side comparison of rocks versus minerals so you can see the difference between the two. Rocks are aggregates of one or more minerals, and they may also contain mineraloids and organic remains. Now, mineraloids are minerals lacking a crystalline structure, so they don't have a definite crystalline structure if they are mineraloids. And organic remains are going to be anything that came from a living thing. So if an animal died, then its body would eventually decay and be organic matter. Any kind of excrement from an animal would be organic remains. And so all of that also can form up rock. So a rock is an aggregate or a combination of one or more minerals, and it could contain mineraloids and it could contain organic remains. So there's no real set combination of what a rock is going to contain. And it has no definite structure or shape. So a rock doesn't have to have a certain structure. It doesn't have to look a certain shape, look like a certain shape whenever you find it. Rocks are more random. You're not going to find them looking the same way every time. Now, minerals are naturally occurring inorganic solids. So nothing organic about them, nothing that came from a living creature or a person. And they have a definite chemical composition. So if you were to look at it, every atom of that mineral should have the same chemical composition and an orderly internal crystalline structure. Now, some minerals may have the same chemical composition but have a different crystalline structure, and the structure determines how it's going to look or what the mineral is going to be called sometimes whenever it has the same chemical composition. And let's see, so that's a mineral. A mineral at its basic point is a naturally occurring inorganic solid, so made naturally from the earth, and it doesn't have anything that used to be alive. It has a definite chemical composition and a definite internal crystalline structure. So it's got to form the same way every time to be a specific mineral. And a polymorph is two minerals with the same chemical composition but a different crystalline structure. So this is what I was talking about, where sometimes, even though two minerals have the same chemical composition, they won't look the same because their crystalline structure is different. And at that basic atomic level, if the crystalline structure is different, what you're able to see with the naked eye is going to appear different. And even if it looks like two different minerals, it isn't going to be the exact same. It'll be a polymorph of the other because it doesn't have the same crystalline structure, even though it has the same chemical composition. So rocks are more random. They don't have to have a definite structure. They don't have to have a definite chemical composition or makeup. It can be made of any combination of minerals, mineraloids, and organic matter. Minerals are going to have a definite chemical composition and an orderly internal crystal structure. So they are more specific. They have to have a definite composition and structure to them, where rocks do not have to have that. Now, rock types are igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. So these are the three rock types that a rock could be classified as, and rocks are classified into one of these three types based on their formation and the minerals they contain. So how were they formed and what are they formed of? When you know those two things, you can classify your rock as igneous, sedimentary, or metamorphic. Minerals are classified by their chemical composition. So you look and see what chemicals it's made up of, what exact atoms make up that mineral at a chemical level, at the tiniest level, and that's how they're going to be classified. Rocks are classified by how they are formed. Are they formed from stress? Are they formed from heat? Are they formed from organic matter? Those kind of things are going to affect how a rock is classified, but that doesn't matter for a mineral. And lastly, the study of rocks is known as petrology. And the study of minerals is known as mineralogy. And side note, geology is the study of Earth as it pertains to the composition, structure, and origin of its rocks. So, rocks are classified based on their formations and what minerals are in the rock. Minerals are classified by their chemical composition. At that basic root level, what are they made up of? Petrology is the study of rocks. Mineralogy is the study of minerals. Rocks are more random. They don't have a definite structure. They're made up of one or many different minerals plus mineraloids and organic matter. Minerals are more specific. They have to have a definite chemical composition and a definite crystalline structure.
Understanding how words relate to each other can often add meaning to a passage. So it's important to understand synonyms and antonyms. Synonyms are words that mean the same thing, and antonyms are words that mean opposite things. So take, for example, the words dry and arid. Those words are synonyms because they pretty much mean the same thing. They have similar definitions. Now the words dry and wet are antonyms because they have opposite definitions. They mean the opposite thing. Now consider these words, friendly and collegial. We would consider these words synonyms. However, they do have slightly different meanings. Friendly means more on an intimate setting, just a friendship, whereas collegial means something more of like an academic or business relationship. However, we still say these are synonyms even though they have slightly different definitions. Because if two words had exactly the same definition, then we wouldn't need two different words. So it stands to reason that synonyms are still going to have slightly different meanings. Now sometimes words are so different that they cannot be synonyms, even though they are somewhat alike. Like, consider the words hot and warm. We would say, yes, these words are alike, but the definitions are different enough, we wouldn't call them synonyms. So, like, take this sentence, for example. He burned his hand on the hot stove. Now, if we said that hot and warm were synonyms, then we could replace hot with warm. And the sentence would say, he burned his hand on the warm stove. But that doesn't really make sense because you don't think of someone burning their hand on something that's warm. So as you can see, hot and warm mean similar things, but they are not synonyms because they are too different in meaning. So the important thing to take from this is that synonyms are words that have exact or similar meanings, and dry and wet are words that have opposite meanings. The narrator plays an important role in the story, and it's important that you as a reader understand the narrator. So a narrator can talk in first person or in third person. In first person, the narrator will use pronouns like I and me because they're talking about things they're experiencing and things they see happening. And in this case, the narrator will actually be a character in the story, so it's important to understand which character they are playing. In third person, the pronouns he and she are used. because the narrator is looking onto the situation, saying, he did this or she did this, and so they're not a character in the story. So that's one thing you need to understand about the narrator. The second thing is how much does the narrator know? And you may be wondering why this is important. But some narrators are going to know what all the characters' thoughts are, and some narrators do not know that. And some narrators will be able to explain to the reader what's going on and their thoughts about it, and some narrators will just let the plot speak for itself. So how much the narrator knows influences how much the reader will know, because however much the narrator knows, they will then tell the reader that. So it's important to understand how much the narrator actually knows. When it comes to summarizing text, you need to be able to state the main point of a story. So a summary is just stating the main point of a story. So you're reading an entire story, and then you're just taking the important things and writing about that. If you've ever looked at the back of a book, you'll see a summary on the back of a book. And so there's a whole book that may be 100 or 200 pages, but the author summarizes it on the back of the book so that you get an idea of what it's about. So that's what you're trying to do through a summary. So there's 4 main points that you should remember when writing a summary. Focus, like I already said, on the main idea of the story. Focus on the key points. In other words, you're not worried about little details. You're worried about the important things that contribute to the overall storyline. The third point is focus on the conclusion of a story. Because in most stories, there's some kind of problem. The whole plot is based around some kind of problem throughout the story. Then eventually that problem is resolved. And so that happens in the conclusion of the story. So look at the conclusion of the story and talk about that too in your summary. So you're going to be talking about the main idea of the story, the key points, the problem, maybe a little bit about the main character, and then talk about the end of the story and how the character ended up dealing with his or her problem. Then the fourth point is kind of a longer one. Focus on important information the author wants the reader to know. So throughout the story, you may notice certain points that the author really wants the reader to understand. And so look for that important information and include that in the summary as well. And so a summary is typically 1 paragraph in length. So it's not very long because it does not need to be long because you're not focusing on details, you're just focusing on the overall story. And so remember, again, you're looking for important information. And so we're not interested in details. Try not to even think about the details, just look for the main idea of the story. Now, in some cases, you might be writing a summary for a long story with multiple settings and scenes. And so a summary may be a few paragraphs in length, and these paragraphs give the main points of each major part of the story. And so the summary of a long story always includes a conclusion to wrap up the story as an entirety. So like I said, the summary is usually going to be 1 paragraph, but if it's a really long story that has lots of different settings, lots of different scenes, lots of different problems throughout the plot, you may need to write a paragraph for each main point or major part of the story. And then for that summary, you're going to write a few paragraphs, and then you're going to write a conclusion that's going to kind of summarize that whole story. And so only make a summary longer than 1 paragraph if you feel like you cannot include all the important information in 1 paragraph. So again, a summary states the main point of a story.
Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now obviously what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme,
but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me? Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now, when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word, will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you can look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green-feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay, we were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky unfamiliar word. Allusion. Allusion is an uncited but recognizable reference to something else. Usually it's going to be a reference to something else in literature. Authors use allusions to make their own text richer. When an author uses an allusion, it gives their own writing the same significance or context that the allusion had. Let's look at some examples. Martin Luther King Jr. started his I Have a Dream speech by saying 50 years ago. This is a clear allusion to President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Lincoln started with 7 years ago. So, even though Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't saying the exact same thing, he started out with 50 years ago, which is similar enough that people knew he was alluding to President Lincoln's speech. This reminded people of the significance of the event. And in reminding people of the significance of the Gettysburg Address, it lent significance to the speech that Martin Luther King was making. Let's look at some other examples. Scrooge. If someone is alluded to as Scrooge, or there's a Scrooge reference in writing, it's going to be someone who is not very generous. They're kind of miserly. They don't like to share. And that would be something that you would have seen in A Christmas Carol, where he goes around and sees what his life would be like if he weren't there and realizes to change his ways. But Scrooge was a very miserly man who didn't want to share with people who really needed it. If you see Pinocchio, it's a reference to someone who is lying. If you see a Trojan horse, it means someone who, or something that is a trick. It looks like the real thing, but really there's a trap concealed inside. An Achilles heel is a reference to Achilles from Greek mythology, and his heel was his one weak spot. So your Achilles heel would be your weak spot, where someone could really get to you. A Romeo from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo would be someone who was really good with women, someone who really loved to, take girls out on dates and was really good at, getting girls to go out on dates with them. Turn the other cheek is a biblical reference when Jesus told people that they shouldn't seek revenge, but should instead turn the other cheek if they're slapped once. Turn the other cheek so you can get hit on the other side of your face. And it's just his metaphor for saying, don't seek revenge. That's not the Christian way. Solomon is another biblical reference. He was a very wise king. So if you're referred to as someone who's like Solomon, it means you've got a lot of wisdom. And a Good Samaritan is another biblical reference, and it refers to the Good Samaritan on the road who helped someone when no one else would. So a Good Samaritan today is someone who helps people or helps a person that no one else is trying to help. So allusions can be used to ground text in a particular time or place, or they can use a cultural reference to make readers feel included. There are lots of reasons that a writer would use allusions, but every time that you use an allusion, it's meant to make your text richer and give your text more than it had before. So when you're reading, watch for allusions. And if you see one of these references, say to yourself, oh, that's an allusion. I learned about those. It's here to make the text richer. And think to yourself, what connotations do you get? How do you feel differently reading that word in the text? What did that word or reference do for your interpretation of the text? Because really, that's what allusion is there for. It's to add to the text and make it better. The Egyptians. The Egyptians lived in a concentrated area along the lower parts of the Nile River around 3000 BC. And they were able to predict flooding and control irrigation, which made the Nile River Valley a very fertile area. And since they grew surplus crops, the Egyptians had time to pursue other interests. So the Egyptians lived in the Nile River Valley, the lower part of the land along the lower part of the Nile River, and they could predict when floods would occur, and they also had control of irrigation techniques. So they were able to farm a lot of that land and grow enough crops that they had plenty to spare. They had some to store up for the future, for times of drought or famine, and they had time to do other things. So they were definitely a farming community, but they had lots of other interests because their civilization developed in a very fertile area that made for an easier life than some of the other civilizations that were developing around the same time period. So the Egyptians developed writing. They had that extra time. They developed a system of writing. They farmed minerals from the valley and surrounding desert. So they figured out what minerals they could use from the ground, and they would go and farm them as well, or mine them out, because they had all this extra time. So they farmed the land, but they also farmed the minerals. They developed a vast trading network. So they have all this extra food, they've got these minerals, they can write, they can make jewelry, pottery. They had a lot of art, and their art and architecture were modeled throughout other civilizations in the surrounding areas as the Egyptians developed more and more. So they had a vast trading network. They would trade very far away from where they lived, and people would come from far away to trade with them. They developed a military to defend against attacks. So you can imagine living in this fertile valley. Other civilizations are going to say, hey, that spot looks really great. I want to live there. I want our people to live there. So the Egyptians did have to defend Egypt against attacks because this Nile River Valley was a pretty popular place, and people saw that it was good land and they tried to make it their own. So Egypt had to develop a military. They formulated an effective system of medicine. So they were able to record symptoms and say, oh, this looks similar to when this other person was sick. This is what we gave them and it made it better. This person doesn't look like they're getting better. They may have this much time to live. This person has a wound. If we put this medicine and wrap it up, it will get better. So they had an effective system of medicine. They organized collective construction. In fact, one of the Egyptians' greatest achievements were their pyramids. And the pyramids were not something that just a few people could build. These took lots and lots of time and lots of manpower to build. So the pyramids are something that a lot of people associate with Egypt even today. And back then, remember I said that a lot of other people modeled the Egyptians' art and architecture. One of their architectural things that people wanted to copy were the pyramids. They were very impressive. Even now they're very impressive, but for them to be able to make it back then without all of the modern equipment that we have was very impressive. So pyramids were originally built as burial sites for pharaohs who were the leaders in Egypt, and they were believed to continue ruling in the afterlife. So they made these huge pyramids, and they buried the pharaohs in there after they died, and they buried them with food and with servants and with animals, with gold, jewels. They wanted them to be entertained and fed and have plenty to drink and have plenty of people to wait on them in the afterlife as well. And so they buried all of this with them, thinking it would all go with the pharaoh to the next life. Peasants worked on the pyramids in exchange for food and shelter. So for people who maybe didn't have their own area of land, people who wanted these pyramids built would say, okay, you come build on the pyramid, we'll feed you and make sure you've got a place to live. The shape of the pyramids is meant to symbolize the slanting rays of the sun, and if you think about the way that the pyramids slant down, and the sloping sides were also thought to help the souls of the pharaohs climb to the sky to join the other gods. So slanting rays down from the sun, but also it slants up toward the sun from the ground, and so the pharaoh's soul was supposed to be assisted by those sloping sides. It could make its way up toward the sky to join the other gods. And just to give you an example of how much time and how much labor a pyramid might take, the largest pyramid from this time took around 20 years and around 100,000 laborers to complete. So if a pharaoh came into power, he better start getting his pyramid built really quickly, because by the time that it was done, it would be about the time he was going to be needing it. So the Egyptians were a very accomplished people. They were very ahead of their time, both in architecture and art, and they lived in the fertile Nile River Valley around 3000 BC. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was dominated by two city-states. Athens was a coastal city made wealthy by overseas trade. Since they were on the coast, they were able to trade far and wide, and that's what produced the wealth for Athens. They had a democratic form of government. So they treated each person as if they were important. There weren't classes. Each person was a part of this democracy. They are known as leaders in philosophy and the arts. In fact, Socrates engaged in dialogues in the street. His student Plato recorded his philosophies, and Plato's student Aristotle developed a strict form of reasoning that forms the basis of Western philosophy even today. And Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these are all names that I'm sure you've heard before. Athens is also famous for its architecture. Namely, the Parthenon. This is something that is still standing today, even if it isn't in as great of a shape as it was back then. And it's just an example of the advanced architecture that Athens was able to develop. Now, this is one of the two city-states. Athens is one of the two city-states that was important in Greece, that dominated Greece, one of the two main city-states. The other one was Sparta. Sparta was a city devoted to agriculture and the military. Located away from the coast and therefore somewhat isolated. So Sparta wasn't as concerned with trade. They didn't live near the coast. They were concerned with agriculture, and they developed a strong military. They didn't try to interact with their neighbors very much. They didn't use open sea to travel anywhere very often. They weren't as big on trade. They were bigger on staying where they were, focusing on agriculture, focusing on military. So they were able to defend themselves and conquer other areas if necessary. Sparta was governed by a strict class system in which people worked the land of other people. So there were higher classes and lower classes, and the lower class people basically worked as serfs. So they worked the land or the fields of the higher class people in exchange for having a place to live and food to eat. But they didn't own any of the land themselves and weren't able to decide what to do with it. Military training was mandatory, with children leaving their homes and families at a very young age to go off and train. Sparta stressed the good of the group over the individual. So they didn't value one person as much as they valued the good or the success of their group, of their culture as a whole, while Athens celebrated the achievements of the individual. And you'll remember Athens was a democracy. Athens celebrated philosophy and the arts, and so they were more focused on the individual's value, where Sparta was more focused on the value and success of the group versus just one individual succeeding or surviving. Now, during the time that Athens and Sparta were the dominant two city-states, there were a few different periods that Greece went through. So one was the Periclean Age. And that was during the 5th century BC. And most of the great contributions to the Western culture were made during this period. The philosophy of Socrates, the medical work of Hippocrates, great dramatic works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So all of these contributions that you still read, these dramatic works, you hear about the Greek tragedies, these were written during the Periclean age. You hear the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. That had to do with the medical work of Hippocrates during the Periclean age. So they made the philosophers and other thinkers of this time made some great contributions during the Periclean age. Now, what helped everyone else find out about these things was the Hellenistic age. And during the Hellenistic age, around the 4th century BC, this period is mostly known for Alexander the Great's military expansions. But without his conquests, without his expansions, without him making the empire larger and larger that he was in charge of, these philosophies and innovations from ancient Greece wouldn't have gotten very far. So the fact that Alexander the Great did go out and conquer all these other areas, he spread the Greek culture. And so he spread these philosophies and these innovations and caused them to have a great impact on the Western culture, the Western world, how everything else developed from there on. If it had only stayed in Sparta and Athens, where the Greek homelands were, it would be a little bit different than if it had actually gone out as far as it did whenever Alexander the Great conquered all the surrounding area and made Greece a much larger area. So ancient Greece was dominated by 2 city-states, the Athens and Sparta. And Athens was a democracy that focused more on the individual, where Sparta focused more on the group. Athens was focused on philosophy and the arts, where Sparta was focused more on the military side of things. And that's kind of reflected in these 2 ages. The Periclean age had to do with the development of philosophies. It was a time of thinking and developing the contributions they were going to have for the world. The Hellenistic age had more to do with military conquest and the spreading of those contributions to the Western world. Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was an explorer from Genoa, Italy. As an adult, Columbus worked as a trader, traveling mostly by sea. So Columbus had a lot of experience at sea. He was an experienced sailor. He had done this for many years of his life. Then he came up with an idea. After many years of presenting his idea, Columbus finally received financial backing from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain in 1492. And this was his idea. He wanted to find a new trade route to Asia, which lay to the east. So Asia lay to the east of them, but he wanted to get there by sailing west. He thought if he started here and went far enough this way, he'd circle back around and hit here. And he would have been right, except that America was in the way. You had 2 continents, North and South America, that were not going to go away. So his plan didn't work out quite like he thought it was going to. Now, he tried for several years to get people to accept this plan, but since they had just come up with the route to go south of the tip of Africa to get to Asia, people weren't as interested in it. Finally, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain said, okay, we feel like maybe there's an idea here, we'll support you and see how it goes. So Columbus was given 3 ships for his first voyage. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he eventually landed near South America. But he thought he had reached the Indies, which is what they called Asia at that time. So Columbus made 4 voyages in all to what he called the West Indies. So he thought by sailing west, he'd reached the Indies, and he called them the West Indies. He made 4 voyages there, and he kept thinking he was reaching the Indies. Now, other people didn't think so. They thought he was getting to different land. But Columbus refused to believe that. He held on to the belief that he had reached the West Indies as he planned to. Now, he didn't discover a new trade route to the Asian Indies. He thought he had, but he hadn't. But he did discover a new trade route. He discovered new land. He discovered a place that had lots of new resources and that opened the door for exploration and colonization of the Americas. So he is credited with the discovery of the Americas. However, Columbus never would admit that he had discovered new lands. He maintained that he had reached the West Indies. Now, he did name some of the islands he found and claimed them for Spain, but he didn't think that he'd reached a completely new continent. He thought he had just reached part of the West Indies, and he refused to believe otherwise and maintained that he had reached the West Indies until the day he died, which is why possibly the Americas aren't named after Columbus, but instead after Amerigo Vespucci, who actually claimed he discovered new lands whenever he came to the Americas. So Columbus was the first person to get to the Americas. He just didn't admit that he'd done it. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a statement that was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. And it was adopted by the 13 American colonies who formed the Continental Congress. Now, the Declaration of Independence said that King George III of Britain had violated the rights of American colonists. He had put into effect different laws and taxes on the American colonists that seemed unfair to them and took away some of their rights. So the Continental Congress convened to try to come up with a solution. Fighting had already been going on for over a year at the time that this Second Continental Congress occurred, and they decided there wasn't going to be a peaceful way to solve things with Britain. So they declared themselves independent. They said King George had violated the rights of these American colonists, and therefore it announced that the 13 colonies considered themselves as independent states, no longer part of the British Empire. Instead, they said that they formed a new union of those 13 states to be known as the United States of America. So they had tried to work things out peacefully. King George did not take back those laws and taxes. Instead, he fought the American colonists whenever they rebelled against following those laws and paying those taxes. And so after a year of fighting, the Continental Congress met again, and they formed this Declaration of Independence. They declared that they were independent of Britain and that they were their own nation now, to be known as the United States of America. They were no longer part of the British Empire. John Adams was a leader at the Continental Congress, and he pushed for independence. So at first, not everyone was for independence. They thought that was a little radical. They thought maybe they could still make things work with Britain. But after a year of fighting, John Adams was still pushing independence, and it was sounding better to everyone. So on July 2nd, 1776, all 13 colonies unanimously approved this idea to declare themselves independent from Britain. John Adams convinced the committee to allow Thomas Jefferson to write the draft. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Congress edited the draft, and the final version was ratified, which means approved. Everyone agreed to it, and it was ratified by all 13 colonies, or states as they were to be known, on July 4th, 1776. So this date is our date of independence. The day we celebrate as Independence Day was the day that our Declaration of Independence had been edited and everyone signed it and approved it. Everyone who was there from the 13 colonies as representatives at this Continental Congress. Now, Jefferson was influenced by John Locke, who was a 17th century writer, and this was evidenced in his ideas about natural rights. John Locke had written about natural rights, and Jefferson included this in his declaration. Jefferson asserted that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So John Locke had said people have the right to life, liberty, and private property. So Jefferson subbed happiness for private property. While, of course, I'm sure he still meant that people could have private property, he put it in a little bit broader terms. Everyone is entitled to life, everyone is entitled to liberty, to be free, and everyone is entitled to pursue happiness. And they felt like King George had infringed on some of those natural rights. And so Jefferson was using most of what John Locke had written whenever he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights that were being violated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson felt and had the Declaration reflect that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of people. Individual rights were more important than the individual's obligations to the state. King George had the opposite idea, and he was trying to force his laws and his taxes on the colonists. So people who were signing the Declaration of Independence were agreeing that people's individual rights were more important than their obligation to the state or to their government. So people's individual rights should come first, and then their obligations to the state. And that is what Jefferson was trying to reflect in the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, 1776, all 13 colonies, all representatives from those 13 colonies, to be known as states, ratified the Declaration of Independence, which declared that King George had violated rights of American colonists, and now those 13 colonies were to be known as the United States of America, a separate new nation that was no longer tied to the British Empire. The First and Second Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. And it was made up of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. So this Continental Congress was called when there was a lot of turmoil between the 13 colonies in North America and Britain, who was supposed to be the country that was in charge of these colonies. Now, the colonies weren't cooperating with what Britain wanted them to do, and the colonists felt like they weren't being treated fairly, so they didn't feel any urge to cooperate. However, they didn't want to go to full-scale war with Britain, so they came up with the First Continental Congress. They sent delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies to try to solve this problem. Georgia did not send a delegate because they were having problems on their frontier with Indians and were hoping that Britain would help them with that, and so they didn't want to get involved in the Continental Congress because they were afraid then Britain wouldn't help them, and they had their own issues with the Indians at their borders, Indians being the Native Americans. So, at the First Continental Congress, these 12 delegates had a goal, and their goal was to achieve a peaceful agreement with Britain. They did not want to go to full-scale war with Britain. They knew that Britain was very powerful. They would be outnumbered if they sent a bunch of people over there, and they just basically wanted to get along but not be treated unfairly. So, the Congress affirmed loyalty to Britain and agreed to let Parliament dictate foreign affairs in the colonies. So they said, okay, Britain, we're loyal to you. Parliament can say what goes on with the foreign affairs in the colonies. However, these colonists demanded that the Intolerable Acts be repealed. And the Intolerable Acts were a series of laws or taxes that were enforced, and some of them were taxes on goods that were just unbelievably high and weren't really warranted. Britain was just being greedy and wanting to make more money off of things than they needed to. And some of the other ones were just things that seemed unreasonable. They were forced to quarter British soldiers in their homes, whether they wanted to or not. And this just led to a lot of different things where they felt like their rights were being invaded. And they also didn't have representation back in Britain. There weren't an equal number of colonists over there in Parliament to represent them, so they felt like they shouldn't be paying as much in taxes. So there were a lot of different issues going on there, but the main thing that the colonists wanted was to have these different laws, known as the Intolerable Acts, repealed. And they instituted a trade embargo with Britain until this happened. So they said, okay, we're not trading with Britain anymore. We're not going to buy any more of their stuff. We're not going to ship them any more of our stuff until they repeal the Intolerable Acts. Otherwise, if they did that, we'd be happy to say we're loyal to Britain. Parliament can be in charge of foreign affairs over here in the colonies. That is not what happened. They did not reach their peaceful agreement. King George III of Britain declared the colonies must submit. They must do as Britain was saying, or face military action. So they've been threatened now. We aren't listening to all this, is what Britain is saying. King George is saying, we don't care that you want to be peaceful, you want this repealed. We're not doing any of that. You listen to us, or there's going to be military action. There will be consequences. So assemblies gathered weapons and formed militias, groups of citizen armies, basically. And these assemblies gathered in all of the colonies. Each colony had an assembly, and it was basically just a group that had collected weapons and sort of formed a militia. The British did not like the assemblies meeting. They didn't want them getting together and making any plans. So they were supposed to break up any assemblies that they wandered onto. And on April 19th, 1775, the British military was ordered to end a meeting of the Massachusetts Assembly. Now, the armed colonists that were in the assembly, because remember, they gathered weapons and had formed militias, the armed colonists resisted the British soldiers, and battles ensued on the Lexington Common. Now, these battles became known as the battles of Lexington and Concord, because that is where the battles between the British military and these armed colonists that were part of the Massachusetts Assembly occurred. And the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So the colonists tried to come to a peaceful solution. It didn't work out. King George said, you're going to listen or there's going to be military action. When the colonists resisted and didn't listen, there was military action. Battles ensued, and the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So, war has started. Now we come to the Second Continental Congress. Clearly, their solutions that they came up with up here did not work, so the delegates met again. This time, delegates from all 13 colonies came. Georgia was included. Georgia realized, Britain's not helping me with my Indian problem. I need to join with the rest of the colonies. So, delegates from all 13 colonies met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, less than a month after Lexington and Concord. So this is April 19th. On May 10th, less than a month after Lexington and Concord, they met. They realized, hey, the British mean business. They're clearly not going to come to a peaceful solution like we wanted. They're not going to repeal the Intolerable Acts. We have to form our own army. We've got to figure out what we're going to do because Britain is definitely going to fight back. So they focused on the defense of the American colonies and local government. Since Britain had been in charge of their government before, they had to come up with their own local government system. So part of what they did was work on local government. Part of what they did was talk about their defense. What were they going to do? So the delegates also discussed declaring independence from Britain. And this was a drastic thing because Britain was controlling all of them. But they said, you know what? We can declare ourselves independent from Britain. They're fighting us. They don't want to do what we want. It's hard to get across that whole big ocean to be over there and actually be represented in Parliament. Why not just have our own separate country over here? and many delegates were in favor of this option. So they established an army and named George Washington commander-in-chief. Now at this point, they did not decide to declare independence. They discussed declaring independence from Britain. Many were in favor, but they hadn't declared it yet. They did establish an army and make George Washington commander-in-chief. They did discuss the defense of the American colonies, which resulted in this army, and they set up a provisional local government, an idea for how that was going to be run. However, by 1776, the delegates realized there was no turning back from full-scale war with Britain, and after this was over, there was no way they were going to patch things up. So they drafted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So your First Continental Congress was about trying to find a peaceful solution with Britain. The Second Continental Congress decided there can't be a peaceful solution. Britain's definitely going to fight us and is not going to give in. So they decided to form their own army. They chose a leader, and eventually they drafted the Declaration of Independence to declare themselves independent of Britain. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 more than doubled the size of the United States. President Thomas Jefferson wanted to have this newly acquired land mapped and explored, since most of the territory was considered wilderness. It was unexplored, nobody knew what was out there. They knew Native Americans were there, but it hadn't been mapped out and no one had laid claim to it out past the Louisiana Territory. Everything in the Louisiana Territory had just been purchased from France, so the United States did own it, but they didn't know what was out there. So Thomas Jefferson wanted to have an expedition sent out there to explore it, map it out, let everyone know what was out there. Jefferson wanted to ensure America's claim on the land. He felt like if he didn't get out there soon enough with Americans and start settling the land, laying a claim to it, proving that it was their land, other nations like Britain or other European countries would come in and say that they were staking claims on certain parts of the land. So Jefferson wanted to get out there quickly. He chose Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to head an expedition into the territory. The expedition included 33 people, and all but one of them made it back. The only one who didn't make it back died of appendicitis. He did not die from anything on the expedition. They traveled from May 1804 to September 1806. So you see they acquired the territory in 1803, and very quickly in 1804, Jefferson was sending an expedition out to start mapping this territory. And you can see it lasted a little over 2 years. It took them that long to travel across the Louisiana Territory and come back to where there were known American settlements. They were searching for a water route that would connect the Missouri River with the Pacific Ocean. And this was for commerce. If they could reach the Pacific Ocean and they could reach potential new settlements along the river, then it would be easier to transport goods back and forth. So Jefferson wanted to know if this was a possibility, so Lewis and Clark were looking for a continuous water route. Though the expedition did make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, they did not discover a continuous water route. So they could go a lot of the way on rivers, but there were the Rocky Mountains in the way and some other areas that cut off one water source from the next. So they weren't able to travel continually by water, but they did travel all the way from known American settlements up the Missouri River and some other rivers, and then across land until they reached the Pacific Ocean. And they'd gone further with mapping than any other Americans had gone. The expedition did draw a variety of maps They recorded their encounters in detailed journals. And the expedition provided knowledge about the land they had traversed, as well as the plants, animals, and people that resided there. So while they didn't discover that continuous water route they were looking for, they were able to bring back a lot from their 2-year expedition. They brought maps, they brought detailed journals that were going to help future expeditions and travelers whenever they started heading out that way, and knowledge about plants, animals, and the people, the Native Americans that lived there. So they drew about 140 maps during their 2-year expedition. They noted over 70 native tribes that were along their route, and they recorded more than 200 new plant and animal species. So, while they didn't do everything they set out to do with finding that continuous water route, they did accomplish a lot. They drew these maps, they noted over 70 native tribes, they discovered lots of new plants and animals that had not been found in America before. And the Lewis and Clark expedition made a clear claim for America in the West, in the Louisiana Territory, and beyond, opening it all up for future expedition, future exploration, and settlement. So Jefferson did accomplish what he wanted to with putting a clear American claim on the land. Physical versus cultural geography. Geography is divided into physical geography and cultural geography. Physical geography is the study of the physical characteristics of the earth. How those characteristics interact with and relate to each other, how they are formed, and how they develop. And different aspects of physical geography include climate, so what kind of weather we have in an area, land, what kind of landforms are in the area, how does the land react with each other, and water, what different kinds of waterways or standing water are in certain areas, as well as how they affect human populations. So all of these are aspects of physical geography, but different landforms in combination with various climates and other physical conditions determine characteristics of individual cultures. So even though physical geography has to do with the land, it does tie into cultural geography. In addition, cultural geography will affect the physical geography because people can make an impact on land as well. So, knowing that physical geography is going to have an impact on cultural geography and include such things as the climate or weather in an area, what kind of landforms, and what kind of water is available, let's look at cultural geography. Cultural geography is also called human geography since it does have to do with how humans interact with environments. And it is the study of how the various aspects of physical geography affect individual cultures. So cultural geography is simply how the physical geography is going to impact the humans that live there. Cultural geography also compares various cultures and how their lifestyles and customs are affected by their geographical locations, climate, etc., as well as how they interact with their environment. So how is their environment influencing them? How are they interacting with their environment and in turn influencing their physical geography? Cultural geography includes, just to give you an idea of what we mean by cultural geography and how the land and the weather and the water, all the physical characteristics can affect the way cultures live. These include language, religion, medicine, cities, economies, government, art, music, other entertainment, and more. So there could be even more than this to mention. So language. People are going to develop a language that includes talking about what goes on around them. If they're located close to other people, they're going to have a language similar to those people most of the time. If they're located far away, their language is going to develop independent of other language, and it will be very different. Their religion can be based on what they live around. For instance, early cultures would worship what they found near them. They could worship trees if they had really tall trees there. Water if they lived near the ocean. Medicine. Medicine is going to be made by what you have nearby in a primitive culture. Now we have airplanes and boats that can ship things where we need them to go. But in primitive cultures, the medicine that you had was going to be made from what you had nearby. What plants do you have available to you to use as medicine? What other elements from the ground do you have that you could use as medicine? Cities. Cities are usually going to develop in an area that can hold a larger population. So somewhere that's well irrigated so it can sustain plenty of food for people. Or cities where you have a port where lots of things can be shipped in by boat or train or eventually plane. Cities are going to build up around those kind of things. Economies. Your economy is going to be based on what you have to sell and what you need to buy. Your government is going to be based on what's important to you in your area. Art is going to be based on what you have available to create with. Music, a lot of times will be, well, you have to look at instruments. What do you have available that you can make into an instrument? And what your songs or music is going to be about, or the purpose of it, can be based on where you live. People made up songs to their gods, and they would be like a thank you or a please help me. If they were praying for rain, and they would be playing music that would be an appeal to the gods for rain. If they were thanking them for a good hunt, the music would be thanking them for that. More into today's life, people would write music about maybe where they are. They'll write about the Great Smoky Mountains, or being down by the beach, or being in a hot, dusty desert. And so the music is sometimes based on what land they're in, what their physical geography is. And other entertainment, like what kinds of games or sports are played there, and what else people come up with for entertainment. And it can go on, because basically it's going to be any way that the humans in an environment are interacting with that environment or being affected by it. And if we look at rural versus urban, rural populations are going to live out away from big cities, and they're going to be more in touch, usually, with their natural environment, because they're going to live closer to it. They're not going to be, they're going to have more open land around them. They're not going to be as clustered together. Where urban societies are going to be bigger cities, there's not going to be as much grass, there's not going to be as many trees, you're going to have more sidewalks, more streets, and so they're not going to be in touch with their natural environment as much as the rural communities in most situations. So, physical geography is the study of the physical characteristics of the earth and how they interact with each other. Cultural geography is the study of how the physical geography affects human cultures. Geographical features. There are many commonly identified geographical features. Plateaus are elevated, but they are flat on top. Some plateaus are very dry, such as the Kenya Plateau, because surrounding mountains prevent them from receiving moisture, either in the form of rainfall or simply clouds and humidity being able to develop in that area. So, some plateaus are very dry, but not all of them. All plateaus are going to be elevated areas that are flat on top. Plateau, flat. Remember plat, flat, and that will help you remember. Plateaus are the flat areas, and that is what makes it a very specific geographical feature, is that they are flat on top. Deserts are another common geographical feature, and deserts receive less than 10 inches of rain per year. So that's what classifies an area as a desert. Where you may receive a couple of inches of rain overnight, a desert is only going to see 10 inches of rain or less per year. And they are usually large areas. You won't usually find a small area that's classified as a desert. It's usually going to be a really large area, such as the Sahara Desert in Africa or the Australian outback. Because if there's an area that's only receiving 10 inches of rain per year, it's usually going to be a geographic location that's spread out over a large area and then slowly transitions into areas with more rain. You usually won't find just one little spot. Deltas occur at river mouths. And because rivers carry sediment down to the delta, these areas are often very fertile. So deltas of rivers would be good areas to grow crops because lots of sediment with new, fresh nutrients would constantly be being transported down to that delta area. Mesas are flat, steep-sided mountains or hills. And this term is also sometimes used to refer to plateaus. So a mesa is different in that it's at the top of a steep-sided mountain or hill, where plateaus could be elevated, but they don't necessarily have to be at the top of a mountain or a hill. They could just be raised up and then go for a really long way without being the top of a mountain or a hill. It could just be a big break in elevation. Now, the term plateau can still be used for mesas because plateaus are flat areas of land. Basins are areas of low elevation where rivers drain. So you've heard of river basins probably, and where a river winds its course, the basin is the area that's kind of carved out by the river and that is a lower elevation than the surrounding land. Foothills are the transition area between the plains and the mountains, so flat lower lands and high mountains. And they are usually made up of hills that gradually increase in size as they get closer to the mountain range. So foothills, you have a flat plain, and then slowly you have higher and higher hills until you get to the mountain peaks. And last we have marshes and swamps. And these are also lowlands like your basin, but they are very wet and usually spread out, and they are largely covered in vegetation such as reeds and rushes. Where a river basin could still hold shrubbery and trees, marshes and swamps are going to be so saturated with water almost year-round so that the only things that can grow there are water plants such as reeds and rushes. Now there are other geographical features. We mentioned mountains, we mentioned rivers, we mentioned plains. All of those are geographical features. These are just some that you might not see as commonly, but they're still important for you to know. Weather versus climate. Weather involves daily conditions in the atmosphere that affect temperature, precipitation, wind speed, air pressure, and other factors. So weather is involving the daily conditions of things, such as temperature, precipitation, how much rain, snow, sleet, or hail we get, the wind speed and direction, the air pressure, any kind of weather-related things, but on a daily basis. Weather focuses on the short term, meaning what conditions will be like today, tomorrow, or over the next few days. Now, climate collects and stores information about daily and yearly weather conditions in a region over a long period of time. Climate takes into account average monthly and yearly temperatures, average precipitation over long periods of time, and the average season of an area, the average growing season of an area. So climate is going to focus on the long term. What conditions will be like from year to year or during certain months or seasons. Climate isn't going to talk about what happens today or tomorrow. It's going to be telling you, in general, in August, the weather is like this. In general, this area of the world will receive this many inches of rain. It's not going to take into account, it's going to take into account the day-to-day weather events, but it's not going to be predicting day-to-day events for you. So weather is short-term. It's more about what's going to be today, tomorrow, the next day. Climate is long-term, what the weather is going to be like in a specific area during a specific time of the year, a specific season or month. It can't predict down to the very day what temperatures will be like, but it can tell you on average what things will be like over a span of days. So climate is used to project more long-term, more big picture weather ideas. So weather and climate are both physical systems that affect geography. However, though they deal with similar information, that information is measured, compiled, and analyzed differently. So just remember, weather is going to involve the more day-to-day events dealing with temperature, precipitation, wind speed, air pressure, anything weather-related is going to be weather if it's short-term. Is it happening today, tomorrow, in a 10-day forecast? Climate is going to be more long-term. Is it going to happen this way every season, every year during the winter? Is it going to be about this temperature? Is our growing season always going to be about this long? Will it always be sunny during this time, or light during this time and dark during this time? So the climate is going to focus more on long-term, where weather is going to focus more on short-term, day-to-day. 5 elements of any map. Some maps will contain more than just this basic information, but any map should contain these 5 elements. First is your title. The title of your map should tell basic information about the map, such as the area represented. So you could have a map of the Wichita Falls city area, or you could have a map of Texas, or you could have a map of the United States, or you could have a map of your backyard. The map could be anything, but the title is going to tell you what, or should tell you, some basic information about the map and the basic area represented by that map. The next element is the legend, which is also known as the key, and it explains what symbols that are used on that particular map represent, such as symbols for major landmarks. So you may see little peaks to equal mountains, or squiggly lines to equal rivers. Those would be symbols that you could find on the map. They stand for mountains or rivers. So you would know if you saw an area with little peaks, there would be mountains there. Or an area with a little squiggle, that would be a river in that area. The third element is the grid. Most commonly represents the geographic grid system, or latitude and longitude marks used to precisely locate specific locations. So on a big map or a map of an actual place, you would often have crisscrossing lines that are going to represent the latitude and longitude of your area and space. You may just have a map of your backyard split up like this. But then you could tell someone in this first square or the second square or the third square where they should find something. And sometimes your grid is set up with letters and numbers. So if I said that there was a tree in this square, you could say in cell C3 on your map you can find a tree. So that is how the grid would work. But these would be your lines of latitude and your lines of longitude. Latitude is flat, longitude is long, up and down. Your next element would be directions. A compass rose, which looks similar to this, or some other symbol, is usually going to be present on the map to indicate the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west. Sometimes a map is set up the way you see it, but north is really off to your right instead of being straight ahead. So having the cardinal directions on the map in the form of a compass rose or some other symbol is helpful to make sure that you are reading the map correctly. And the last element of any map is going to be a scale. And the scale shows the relation between a certain distance on the map and the actual distance in real life. For example, 1 inch might represent 1 mile, or 10 miles, or even more depending on the size of the map. So if I drew this little picture, I could say 1 inch might actually equal 10 feet in that backyard. So a scale is just going to tell you what the measurement that you can do on that map in centimeters or inches is going to be equal to in terms of real life measurements of feet or yards or miles, depending on how large of an area your map is representing. So the 5 elements that you should see on any map and be able to identify are the title, legend, grid, directions, and scale.